Does body count matter, or have we just become too afraid to ask? A person's sexual history doesn't necessarily define their worth. However, research does link higher partner numbers with issues related to emotional connections, relationships, and physical health. In this episode, I want to discuss and explore how promiscuity impacts men and women differently and the consequences for both. So, without further ado, I thought I'd just touch on this subject based off a podcast I just appeared on, and I thought I would explore it a bit more as it's something I've been interested in. I have sort of touched on it in some of my earlier videos, which you might have seen around relationships on my channel. So go back and have a look through there and see if you can find it. But we want to talk about women, and then we're going to talk about men, and then we're going to talk about men and women together as a unit and what promiscuity can mean for both of them. So, as I've said in my previous videos, I was a bit promiscuous when I was younger, and I regret that, and I wouldn't encourage it for men or women, all right? I don't think it's a positive thing, and I don't think it's a positive thing for society more broadly, let alone individuals and their relationships, certainly meaningful relationships. So, first of all, let's talk about women and the fact that STIs and reproductive damage can occur due to promiscuity. So quite clearly, the clearest female-specific cost for promiscuity is damage to their reproductive health, and any untreated infections which can occur and linger. And how do we know that? Well, we know that because pelvic inflammatory disease affects 1 in 8 women in Australia, according to the Australian government, okay? And not only that, but women are more exposed to STIs and other reproductive health, and we know that through the University of Alabama at Birmingham, who conducted a review which explained that female urogenital anatomy presents a larger, thinner mucosal surface, and that several infections are more often asymptomatic, that being obviously that they don't show any symptoms, which is obviously problematic if you want to get treatment and you don't even know you've got an issue. Now, if we understand that, well, we understand that more partners mean more opportunities for exposure to pelvic inflammatory disease and other STIs like chlamydia, gonorrhea, etc., or more serious things like STDs related to HIV or even bloodborne disease like hepatitis C. So often these infections can be undetected in women and progress then later to pelvic inflammatory disease, which is very serious, can cause chronic pelvic pain and ectopic pregnancies and other issues with tubal infertility. So that's a massive issue for a lot of women. Now, on women further, we need to understand the emotional and social consequences for promiscuity for women. And the fact is that the emotional sex difference is most visible for women who overwhelmingly regret casual sex on average when compared to men. Now, how do we know that? Well, we know that through a large US multi-university study of 24,230 people, where it was found that 46% of women reported regretting casual sex compared with only 23% of men. So let me state that again. That study from the United States found that within 24,230 people, the women in that were 46% reported regretting casual sex compared with 23% of men. So that's a serious issue, all right? Now, there's supporting studies around that as well. So the supporting studies actually came from Australia here at the James Cook University, and they surveyed 701 people, and again found that women generally reported more negative emotional outcomes based on the sex. And the motives and whether the encounter was generally wanted mattered significantly to those women. All right. So what do these studies suggest and what do they show? Well, they show that the average difference is very real between men and women and regret after casual sex, right? It's a very significant issue, and it's found in numerous studies and not just these two studies. it doesn't mean that every single woman is harmed through sex or anything like that necessarily, but we can see that there may be some biological elements that leads to women having this regret after casual sex, although we can't necessarily prove that. It's likely an evolutionary psychology matter and a biology matter to explain it. I mean, that, and obviously if the sex isn't nice, right, there's a lack of sexual satisfaction involved, or pressure or coercive control, anything like that, including stigma attached to it, then we know that that's an issue. But that's the main thing to understand, is that the study quite clearly found that 46% of women versus 23% of men regretted having casual sex in that large sample of over 24,230 people at a multi-university study level. That is significant, and we need to understand that and consider that moving forward. Now, if we look at men, right, we understand that overwhelmingly the STI burden is male majority, okay? The sexually transmitted infections are more common with men. Now, it's not massively more common with men, but what we understand from the Australian data is that for about the 90,400 STI notifications that were made from general practitioners and doctors in 2024, 58% of those notifications were for men. Okay, so it's a slight majority, but still that's something to talk about, right? If we're going to talk about women's issues being a majority, even if it's not that much of a majority, we need to do that with men as well. And the fact of the matter is, there are similar health issues that can occur if these things are untreated for men, although they're probably less likely to be asymptomatic generally with men. And those things can be things like clinical identifiers that indicate epididymitis. Probably pronounce it terribly, sorry about that. Inflammation of the testicles or prostate, reduced sperm quality, motility, and all kinds of things related to overall infertility and male complications in that regard. So it can be serious. It's not something to be taken lightly by any measure. So men may not carry pregnancy, but they have a greater exposure to STIs, which still produces measurable male disease burden and causes them issues. And those diseases, obviously, that they have can then be spread to women. And we know that women are more susceptible and more likely to catch STIs due to their anatomy. Okay, so that's an important thing to know. But really, men don't escape the cost of casual sex, right? It shows up in that notification data, all right? Now, that kind of explains why, I mean, the same encounter for casual sex might be celebrated by one sex, that being men, but by the other sex, it carries deep regret, okay? And that all ties together around that. Now, what else do we know? Interestingly enough, around men who have multiple partners, there seems to be some sort of connection with substance dependence, although the causal effect, correlation causation is not necessarily clear. So for men, the strongest mental health signal is not necessarily depression. It's the link with alcohol and drug dependence that seems to come with higher numbers of casual sexual partners. Okay, so we know this from a study out in New Zealand from the University of Otago's Dunedin longitudinal birth cohort study, which tracked partner numbers and later psychiatric diagnosis from the ages of 18 to 32 while adjusting for prior mental health and substance problems, right? So very thorough study. And what they found is that among the young men, what they found is that having more than one partner per year at ages 18 to 20 predicted nearly 3 times the later risk of substance dependence, right? And higher partner exposure showed a dose-response pattern. Now, that's a bit complicated to sort of explain, but what we need to understand from that result, we know from that New Zealand, that University of Otago Dunedin study, that men who had more than one partner a year at ages 18 to 20 predicted nearly a 3 times later risk of substance dependence and abuse. That's significant, right? Now, what we also know from the study, and what the study supports, is there's the strongest consistent male association was later substance dependence rather than anxiety or depression. The pattern remained after earlier mental health and substance problems were considered. Okay, so a literal substance abuse as opposed to the anxiety or depression was actually even more apparent there, which is interesting, although you would argue that those would occur concurrently at the same time. So the fact of the matter is that for men, promiscuity can travel with addiction issues and substance abuse long after the casual encounter begins, and that is something that needs to be discussed. Now, what else do we know? Well, let's discuss how this affects men and women equally, at least to some extent, or at least in the context of having serious relationships, and in particular, marriage. So if we look at marriage stability and happiness, we know that higher levels of promiscuity in the past are negatively correlated, right? And significantly so with positive outcomes in marriage, okay? Well, how do we know that? Well, we know that because a major United States longitudinal study found that people entering marriage with 9 or more partners had roughly 3 times the odds of divorce, and those who had 1 to 8 partners had 50% higher odds of divorce. Okay, so let me restate that. If you're in a marriage and you had more than 9 casual sex partners before you got married, it indicated or led to a 3 times increase in the likelihood that you would divorce. And if you had 1 to 8 casual partners before marriage, it was likely that that would lead to a 50% increase in the chance that you would get divorced. Once again, that's really significant. Now, what else do we know about marriage stability in that regard? Well, we know that the numbers can be split into 3 numbers, 45, 25, and 14. So what do those numbers indicate? Well, the Wheatley Institute survey of 3,750 married US adults found a very high stability among 45% who had slept with only their spouse, okay? 25% with 5 to 9 partners, and 14% with 10 or more. So how do I encapsulate that? Well, let's just use both sides of the spectrum. Those who had only slept with their partner and were married to their partner showed that they had 45% marriage stability compared to 14% marriage stability for those with 10 or more partners. Okay, so once again, there was a link there with the more people you'd slept with in the past, the less likely you would have marriage stability. So that's a big issue. Now, in addition to that, and building on that, we can look at marital happiness. So what do we know there? Well, from the United States again, through the National Survey of Family Growth, they found that 65% of women who had slept only with their husband described their marriage as very happy, compared with 52% reporting 6 to 10 life partners. Now, 65% versus 52% is not massive necessarily, but that is still a significant difference that needs to be considered. So overall, we see if you have more promiscuity, right? If you have more promiscuity before marriage, there is likely, at worst, a 3 times increase in the chances of divorce, right? Only a 14% chance that you have, or what you consider to be stability in the marriage, and only about 52% marriage happiness, okay? That is a serious impact for men and women regarding promiscuity, right? So, although your sexual history is not your human worth, it's important to consider that if you're going to choose a spouse, patterns linked to stability and happiness are relevant, and their promiscuity, their history, is an indicator that that stability, that happiness may be impacted in the marriage. Now, on this point, I want to say something as well. If we know that the majority of marriages, I believe it's anywhere in the range of 49 to 69% apparently, are ended by women. So we know that about 49 to 69% of marriages are ended by women in divorce, right? Then a question has to be asked, is there a correlation between the these numbers I've just mentioned about divorce rates, about stability and happiness, and is it likely that those women who are divorcing are the same women who were very promiscuous when they were younger? It'd be very interesting to know that. I'd like to see the divorce data and know, when surveyed those women and men, whether those women had those more than 10 people they'd slept with before they got married. That's a really interesting point. And I would say on that basis alone, we can maybe deduce from that and say, well, again, actually, promiscuity impacts women significantly more for their long-term relationships, as example by the fact that they initiate most divorce, and as example by the fact that these divorce numbers actually even exist at all, right? So that's something very important to consider. But I think, as contentious as it might be, it doesn't mean that people aren't capable of changing their lives and aren't capable of redemption. They really are, okay? But I think we also know that generally people who have higher promiscuity are probably the kind of people who have issues with impulse control, and that impulse control likely stems from an underlying psychiatric illness like borderline personality disorder or complex post-traumatic stress disorder or rape trauma syndrome or any number of issues. Not only that, but it also may relate to issues with abuse, with their upbringing, an absent father in particular, and their need as women particularly to seek validation from men, and that will be an issue. Now, for men, we see that it's less of an issue, and in fact, having higher body count, if you will, for men can actually be an attractive thing to women, because women confirm who they want to sleep with based on whether that man's been confirmed by other women to be worthy of sleeping with. So although she might think, oh, that's not attractive, he slept with a lot of women, I don't want to be with a sleep around because he might have STIs, a lot of those women will still make an exception for that man because they know that other women have felt safe enough to sleep with him. And if he slept with a lot of women, it may indicate that he has sexual prowess and is good in bed, which is something that an average healthy sexual adult would probably look for, and in this case, women looking for those men. Now, at the other side of things, the average woman or even below average woman can sleep with a lot of men. The average man, or even slightly above average man, generally cannot sleep with a lot of women, okay? So the numbers don't really work that way. And when women make this thing of, well, all the men can just casually sleep with women and they don't get in trouble, why can't I? Well, that's a bit of a zero-sum game and a race to the bottom. The fact of the matter is, you're, as a woman, are assuming a lot of men are sleeping with a lot of women because the men you're going for are at the top of the ladder in the male hierarchy who are sleeping with a lot of women. The average guy isn't. So it's just not the case that most average men are sleeping with a lot of women. In fact, men are more likely to be sexless, and this has been reported in 12-month data, are more likely to be lonely, whereas women are more likely to be having sex and are less likely to be looking for relationships, okay? So men are more sexless, women are having more sex. So that is simply not true. But anyway, look, that's just a short, quick video on this data. I'd like to talk about it, obviously, a little bit more, and I really appreciate your support in watching this. Don't forget to follow me on my TikTok, my Instagram, my Facebook, and here on YouTube, and share this video with as many people who want to hear it, okay? Or who you think might actually need to hear it. Maybe you've got some promiscuous friends that need to hear this. But anyway, that's sort of all I've got to say for the time being. But as always, thanks for watching, and I hope you have a great day.